Part 6. A Life in Hell. The farce of unbridled lies and flagrant coercion of witnesses played out there in a courtroom. This was the American judicial system at its very worst. There were 4 indictments of Indians issued in late 1975 for the deaths of the 2 agents. I was one of the 4. Only 3 of us ever went to trial. Charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence against the 4th, Jimmy Eagle, whose alleged theft of a pair of cowboy boots had provided the FBI with its fabricated excuse for invading the Jumping Bull property in the first place. Strange. The murders of scores of traditionals on the reservation in previous months they all but totally overlooked, but the alleged theft of a pair of cowboy boots, later dismissed in court, became the immediate subject of a massive FBI investigation. My AIM brothers, Dino Butler and Bob Robidoux, were eventually captured, falsely charged with the murder of the 2 agents, and then put on trial in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in July 1976. By then, I was under arrest in Canada, fighting extradition back to the U.S. At the Cedar Rapids trial of Butler and Robidoux, the jury, appalled at the overwhelming evidence of government complicity in the ongoing terrorism at Pine Ridge, as well as the flagrant FBI conduct at every stage, found Butler and Robidoux not guilty. They ruled that in firing at the unknown and unannounced invaders at the Jumping Bull property that day, Butler and Robidoux had acted in self-defense, which, indeed, they had, as had I and many, many others that day. After the acquittal of Butler and Robidoux, I became the last defendant they had left to pin with the phony rap. Charges against Jimmy Eagle were dropped so that, according to FBI documents later revealed, the full prosecutive weight of the federal government could be directed against Leonard Peltier. The government needed a scapegoat, a conviction to assuage its severely damaged public image. Someone had to pay for the deaths of the 2 agents, even if the feds didn't know who had done it, as the prosecutors themselves later confessed. They wanted Indian blood, and I became the scapegoat, the one they had been setting up all along. I suppose they figured that if I got off like Butler and Robidoux, it would somehow be open season on FBI agents. That may be understandable, but it's also absurd, of course. Pure fantasy on their part. There was never any open season on FBI agents by Indian people, nor was there ever any plan or even suggestion for one. Maybe some of those FBI agents actually believed the disinformation their own agency was shamelessly handing out for public consumption. But one thing was for sure. There had been an open season for several years on the traditional Indian people of Pine Ridge and on their AIM supporters. Examine the death toll over those years on Pine Ridge if you doubt it. FBI deaths by violence, 2. Agents Culler and Williams. AIM/traditional deaths by violence, 60 and counting, even by the government's own statistics. We believe the number is much higher. May all their souls, every single one, rest in peace. I was arrested in Western Canada on February 6, 1976, the date from which my sentence officially begins. After hiding out in South Dakota for several weeks, I slipped across the Canadian border and had been living with some native brethren, to whom I'll always be grateful, in the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia. For most of that year, I was jailed in Vancouver. The FBI was determined to do anything, however illegal, to get me back, and it did. Fraudulent affidavits from an Indian woman named Myrtle Poorbear were presented to the Canadian courts, claiming that she was an eyewitness to the agents' deaths and also an ex-girlfriend of mine. Furthermore, she claimed that I was the father of her children. If you've ever had someone proclaim a total and utter lie about you, and realized that everyone who heard it believed that lie, you can have some slight understanding of how shocked and sickened I felt that day at the extradition hearing. When I heard read in that Canadian courtroom the lies they'd stuffed in that poor woman's mouth. Poorbear's statements about me in court made front-page headlines in Vancouver. Peltier's girlfriend testifies against him, claiming she was an eyewitness. I had not the slightest idea who this woman was, having never met or heard of her in my life. She, like me, like each and every one of us, was a pawn in the government's illegal and malicious game. Several years ago, evidence was uncovered that flatly proved the government had suborned this witness and coerced her false affidavits. They knowingly and with despicable cruelty manipulated and terrified a poor, helpless Indian woman into giving false testimony in order to convince the Canadian government to extradite me. Another one of their victims. Her affidavits have since been exposed for the misstatements they were, and elected Canadian officials have demanded my return to Canada, expressing shock at the government's willful misrepresentations in gaining my extradition. Chapter 29. Since the day of my capture by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, my life has become one unending blur of jails and prisons, with occasional visits to courtrooms. First in Canada for my extradition hearing, since then here in the States. Handcuffs and leg irons and strip searches, spread 'em, Tonto, have become my daily routine. They don't just take your freedom from you, which you'd think would be enough, but they demean and humiliate you, it seems, wherever and whenever. They create vastly more crime and injustice and inhumanity than they ever prevent. All prisons, without exception, are cruel and unusual punishment. Every one of them should be declared unconstitutional. As a supposed cop killer, I got special attention from the start. In my first jail in Canada, a special guard was stationed outside of my cell throughout the night. That would be the norm over the coming months. When I was brought the next day to the Metropolitan Jail in Vancouver, I found myself surrounded by a group of openly angry cops. One of them removed my handcuffs so they could blame what was coming on me, I suppose. And the others rolled up their sleeves and started coming at me with clenched fists, absolute hatred on their faces. I got ready to fight back as best I could. I figured I could lay 2 or 3 of them out before they got me, but I can tell you, for a few minutes I was pretty sure they'd kill me right there. Only the intervention of the RCMP sergeant, who'd brought me there, saved me that time. Yeah, there are good cops. Lots of them. But there will always be the others too. You quickly learn within the walls that you are at the mercy of anyone with a sadistic streak, and there's seldom any shortage of those. I could see out of my little cell window in that first Vancouver jail, and as I pulled myself up on the bars, I looked out and saw, of all people, my mother, standing down there below in the street. I yelled out at her, "Ma! Ma!" But when I looked down there again, she was gone. It was like some apparition had appeared to me, but she later told me that she had been there, and she'd heard me calling. That same afternoon, I was moved from the Metropolitan Jail to Oakala Prison. I was processed and assigned to a high-security cell block, where some fellow Indian inmates learned who I was and offered to provide me with a security guard of my own. Almost immediately, I was moved to an even higher security tier, just one level above death row. All 6 cells on that level were emptied so I could have the place to myself. My seemingly eternal personal world was 5 feet by 9 feet. Pretty typical almost everywhere I've found, and was furnished with the usual seatless steel commode, sink, and steel bunk with a 2-inch mattress, 2 sheets, 1 blanket, no pillow. No personal belongings, not even a book to read. The only light came through the front bars. After my legal team began to file motions in court and got representatives from foreign embassies to visit my cell, conditions improved. I was allowed books, art materials, newspapers, and even got a TV stationed out in front of my cell on my exercise area, which consisted of a space about 25 feet long and 15 feet wide. I later learned I was getting the exact same treatment as an inmate on death row. For a while, they even put me in a cell on death row itself, right between 2 inmates who were about to be executed. One of them was Indian. The other was a white guy who'd been convicted of killing an RCMP officer while robbing a store and was scheduled to be hanged the following morning. I suppose they put me there so I could get the feel of it. The gallows was visible a few feet from our cells in another room. They thoughtfully left open the door so we could see the scaffold with its 2 hanging ropes. The white guy didn't say much. He just sat there on his bunk, staring at the floor, head down, hands clenched tightly between his legs. I noticed that one of his knees kept shaking uncontrollably, and he made a shrill whistling sound when he breathed. Amazingly, in a movie-like last reprieve, they came in and informed us the next morning that the government had just abolished the death penalty. My 2 fellow death row inmates were given life sentences, which meant they had to do a minimum of 25 years. If they lived, they're due to get out just about now. A few of the guards at Oakala seemed to have at least a certain sympathy with Indian causes and spoke to me with some respect. And, as usual, there were the officers who tried almost every day to give me incident reports, threatening to have me tossed in the hole. That was a laugh. I'd quickly learned that the hole was no worse than where I was being held. In some ways, even better. So I just shrugged and told him, "Okay, well, hell, go on. Give me a break and send me to the hole." A short while later, 5 prisoners actually escaped from Oakala while being held in the hole, and that sort of stifled the guards' threats for a while. They loved to find ways of tormenting me, mostly with verbal abuse. They would have conversations intended to be overheard by me, about how stupid and filthy Indian people were, about how ugly our women were and how they had such loose morals, about how our children were defectives and should be rounded up and shot like stray dogs. Oh, that got a laugh. They were hoping I would blow up, vent a little anger and give them the opportunity to beat the shit out of me or worse. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I would never become what they wanted me to be. I would refuse to be their victim. I am not a victim. I am a warrior. I will accept my pain, whether inner or outer, as a warrior does, without whining, without whimpering, as we learn to do in Sundance. Sundance sends us out into the world hardened against pain, the way a charred stick is hardened against fire. That doesn't mean you can't break or kill us, but you're sure going to have to work like hell to do it. So I never responded, except maybe with the look in my eyes, to those racist goads by those guards and others like them. I refused to be as ignorant as they were. The day before my scheduled extradition back to the States in mid-December 1976, I was again moved to an even higher security cell. This one had 4 walls of steel bars, and it was lined with thick plexiglass. A steel cage inside a plastic box. I've often wondered, who thinks these things up? Who designs them? Are there courses in college that teach you how to engineer such torture chambers? A guard was stationed right in front of that cell and was ordered to never take his eyes off me, not for an instant. And he didn't. Though I swear he must have gone cross-eyed looking at me every time I took a crap or peed. For a while I tried to look back at him the same unflinching way he was looking at me until his face grew red, his nose twitched, and he raised a beefy arm with a trembling, clenched fist. His eyes were more fearful and pleading than murderous. I half smiled, shrugged, and looked away. We both now knew that I had him just as much as he had me. We were both prisoners, that guard and me. I guess I was momentarily given some vague optimism by the Canadian Minister of Justice's promise through my attorneys that once I had signed the extradition papers, I would be treated humanely and be given a fair trial in the States. So I was eager by now to get this over with, to have my trial and be found innocent, same as my AIM brothers Bob Rubidoux and Dino Butler had done in their Cedar Rapids trial that previous summer. I figured that my case would create so much public exposure of the wrongdoings of the FBI in Indian country that the U.S. government would be forced to give me a fair trial. I was too naive to see that the Canadian Minister of Justice carried no weight at all in the States. Nor had I yet quite come to realize that I was the only one the FBI had on whom to pin the deaths of their agents at Oglala. And as you know, they always get their man, even if he's not their man. On the morning I was to leave, the RCMP had a large military helicopter flown into the prison yard. I was given my civilian clothes and put in double handcuffs and leg irons. I was whisked away to a nearby military airport where I was transferred to a general's private Air Force jet, and in a few hours was landing in Rapid City, South Dakota. Back in the good old USA, yeah! After a few more hours in the county jail, I was taken before the U.S. magistrate to be arraigned. The magistrate tried to appoint me a public defender who looked to me like he'd just walked out of a law school classroom. I told him I would be getting competent lawyers to represent me, but he still insisted I accept this public defender. I said I wasn't going to accept this law student to represent me on such serious charges. I demanded to represent myself until my own lawyers could be contacted. He grudgingly agreed, arraigned me over to trial, and set no bond. I wasn't back in my cell 15 minutes when I was whisked back out to the Rapid City Airport, flown across the state to Sioux Falls, and dumped into something called the Holding Center cell block at the Sioux Falls State Prison, one of those finishing schools where AIM had had its beginnings a decade earlier. So here I was, being held in a hole without knowing if I had any attorneys or if my family or supporters even knew where I was, without a penny to buy stamps or cigarettes or pencil and paper to write on. I had no way of knowing what was going on in the outside world, or if anyone really gave a damn. All the other prisoners I saw were white. I couldn't have been more alone, more isolated. I decided to keep my mouth shut and go to sleep. I had about 6 or 7 Canadian cigarettes left, and I decided to light one up first, lying on the bunk and blowing the smoke at the ceiling, wishing to myself that each puff of smoke could somehow carry a prayer up to Sky World. I could sure have used some help from up there. At least a small sign that the Great Spirit still remembered I existed. Then I heard a husky voice from the cell next to mine. "Hey, man, is that a cigarette you're smoking there?" It was a white guy about my age, mighty tough looking. I said, "Yeah, so?" I figured he was going to give me a hard time about it. "Well, stop smoking it right now," he said, "and let me finish it for you. If you do, I'll give you 5 postage stamps." Turns out, mine were the only cigarettes in the hole. They were worth their weight in gold, or at least in postage stamps. They were worth even more than that in friendship. I wasn't about to become a capitalist and make a big profit on it at this point in my life. I offered him 1 full cig for 1 postage stamp. A fair trade, I thought. "So I can write my family and let them know where the hell I am," I told him. He was very appreciative, and must have thanked me 10 times as he lit up and sucked in deep on that forbidden tobacco, focusing on it almost prayerfully. I figured Great Spirit must have been answering both his prayer and mine. Strange how a cigarette and a postage stamp can become real treasures, almost miracles under certain circumstances. I got my stamp along with some paper, pencil, and an envelope from my new friend. He asked me my name, and when I told him, he got really excited. "You're Leonard Peltier? Oh, man, wow!" He shouted down the range. "Hey, we got Leonard Peltier here! You hear me? Leonard Peltier!" I was beginning to realize that I wasn't forgotten. But it was almost embarrassing, too. A chorus of voices yelled out encouragement to me, and suddenly my isolation had dissolved. I even heard a few guys call out, "Hang in there, bro!" And I knew there were at least a few Indians in there with me. Damn, compared to a few minutes before, I felt right at home. So I passed the rest of the cigarettes on through the bars, and they got passed down from one cell to another, each guy taking a couple deep drags and passing it on. We all had a collective smoke, and in a way, a collective prayer. and somehow those 6 half-crumpled, half-mashed Canadian cigs seemed to last a dozen or so men for hours, long into the night until we all fell asleep. Sort of reminds me of the loaves and fishes I used to hear about as a kid in the white church my grandma took me to. I never believed it back then, but now I'm open to the idea, having experienced it firsthand with those half-dozen Canadian cigs. Sometimes it's the little, ordinary miracles that give you the strength to carry on. I'd need it to handle what was coming in the following months, as I was transferred to and from various jails around the region. Police and guards routinely threatened me with sure death, no matter what happens to you in the courts. I was fed cold, tasteless meals, denied exercise, visits from my family, even showers. At one jail, a trustee told me that they had been urinating in my food. When I shoved the food back through the slot in the door, they shoved it back in and told me, "Eat this or die, you piece of shit!" Figuring I'd rather die of starvation than eat that, I shoved it back through the slot. They shoved it in. When I shoved it back again, the sheriff and half a dozen guards appeared outside my cell. The door slid open, and they all stood there, a wild-eyed mob ready to pounce on their prey. Then they started coming in. I stood at the rear of my cell facing them, with my back to the wall. "Come on! It's a good day to die!" I barked at them. "Let's get it on!" I guess that made them blink. I sure wasn't kidding. They all pushed into the cell till it was completely full, then shouted and screamed and spat and waved their fists at me. I shouted and screamed and spat back and waited for them to come. Hell, a quick death at their hands was preferable to a lifetime of prison any time. I figured I'd take a few of them with me if I could. "Who wants it?" I asked. I hid my own fear. I could feel my bowels go loose inside my belly, but I just held it in. Then the sheriff, who had his fist clenched in the air right in front of my nose, and who had been egging them on, locked his eyes on mine, realized he was going to be the first, and got a sudden scared look in his eyes and backed off. He ordered everyone out, and they all backed out. Amazed, I yelled after them, "Hey, come back in! You bunch of cowards! Come on!" They locked the door behind them and melted away. After 4 more days, during which I ate not a bite of their food, that sheriff called the marshal's office to come and get me out of this jail before I died. That would have been bad press, so they came and got me. I can't remember all the other lockups before and during and after my trial in Fargo. By now my attorney, Bruce Ellington, threatened a lawsuit unless I was given at least minimal privileges, and after months of isolation, I was finally allowed a brief, behind-the-glass, over-the-phone visit from my family. Finally, about 2 days before my sentencing in Fargo, I was able to get a rare, good shower and a clean shave. I was given a set of fresh, clean clothes and was briefly treated almost like a human being. Welcome to Leavenworth. On June 1st, 1977, at 9 a.m., I received my 2 life sentences in the Fargo courtroom, then was immediately whisked out the door under heavy guard to the Fargo airport. A couple of hours later, I landed at the Kansas International Airport and was driven by car to the U.S. Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, less than an hour's drive away. A cold chill ran up the back of my neck when we drove past the long 18-foot-high wall and up the front entranceway of Leavenworth. The overwhelming size of the place is frightening, made even more bizarre by its silver-painted central dome, mockingly reminiscent of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Along with its phalanxes of stone walls and cyclone fences and coils of razor wire, and its empty-eyed stone lions guarding the front steps beneath the looming gun tower, all of it seemingly the work of some demented and sadistic architect, every detail arranged, no doubt, for the sheer, nauseating terror of it. I walked in my shackles and leg irons, up the front steps, to the first of a seemingly endless series of steel doors. I thought I could hear distant screams coming from somewhere within the building, or maybe it was just the wind, howling in the razor wire atop the walls. Suddenly your mind begins to play tricks on you, and it's as if you hear your spirit telling you to run, to not go in there. And then the fear rushes on you almost unbearably. Your knees grow weak. You feel as if you're going to wet your pants. You feel like crying, calling out for help. I had a barely resistible urge to turn to the marshals and plead with them, beg them not to take me in that place. I'm sure if I had, my voice would have cracked and I would have broken down in tears. And maybe I would have done that. Except that something saved me. Because when I turned to one of the marshals who was leading me up the stairs, hoping to find some glint of human warmth in his eyes, I saw, instead, not a face at all, but a mask of absolute hatred, and a look in his eyes so vile that it can't even be described. He saw my terror and my weakness, and he was enjoying it like a fine wine. I couldn't say anything. He just smiled a devil's smile and said in an almost cheerful voice, "You're dead. You fucking Indian bastard. You'll never get out of this building alive. We'll see to that. We'll get you one way or another. Why don't you make a run for it, you chicken shit punk? Go on. Make a hero out of me. Hey, I'll get a promotion if I wax you." I swear, I saw his face and head turn into a serpent's, spitting its venom at me. My mind was spinning and racing. My knees wobbled. I felt faint, breathless, and I could hardly take the next step up the stairs. Then that look of utter evil on his viper face suddenly, I can't explain how, gave me a hot, surging strength. The more he glared his hatred at me, the stronger I became. That's something you learn about that kind of hatred. It gives you the strength to overcome it. Spirits inside shouted at me to stay strong, to fight back this rage and this fear running so madly through my mind, to bring myself under control before I lost all self-respect and became the quivering, whimpering victim he wanted me to be. My strength and courage suddenly came roaring back to me like a hot volcanic tidal wave. My legs stopped wobbling. My breath came back. My mind flashed with the bright images of Sundance, of the holy tree of life, connecting me to the world, of the skewers threaded into my flesh, and the thongs being pulled tight until the straining flesh broke, freeing me. And I immediately connected with that holy pain and found in it an inexhaustible source of strength. Yes, this was all simply an extension of my Sundance. This was my offering to Tankashila, the great mystery. My flesh, my life, my very existence. They could entomb my body, but my spirit they could never touch. I turned to this snake in human form, suddenly as calm as I'd ever been in my life. And just as he was telling me for the last time, "Run, you fucking bastard!" I smiled back at him and told him quietly, "Okay, let's go for it. But be a man about it. Give me a chance by taking off one of these leg irons, so I can at least make a run for it. Come on. Then you can be the hero you always wanted to be. Don't miss your opportunity. I'm ready. Let's do it." His face turned to a look of pure shock and disbelief. He just stood there, wide-eyed, staring back at me in alarm. And, yes, in fear. The second marshal right next to him pushed me ahead up the stairs, barking, "Keep moving, punk!" I snorted out an inappropriate obscenity and kept moving. What's more, I kept feeling stronger every second. No way they were going to destroy me. When we got inside the building and I'd been pushed through a series of sliding doors with dark glass windows, I was told where to stand in one room. While standing there, I could see the reflection in the dark glass of the two marshals talking to the guard in the control room through the speaking hole cut in the glass. Then a voice came over the speakerphone. "Press your nose against the wall. Go on, punk. Press it into the wall there. Go on." I just stood there. Again came the voice. "Press your goddamn nose into the wall or you're going to get your ass kicked good." Again, I paid no attention. I've found in general that no response at all is the best response to the countless empty and not so empty threats you get within these walls. Be ready. Keep loose. Stay expectant. And do nothing. Outlast the bastards. It doesn't always work, but it usually does. And so the long, long blur of my prison life began. I won't bore you with the countless transfers from Leavenworth to other federal prisons, then back again, then out again, and back yet again. Terre Haute, Marion, Springfield, and so on, each of them with infinite large and small horror stories of their own. When you're a house guest in hell, you learn the devil has many mansions, and you keep shuttling between them for no known reason. At least in hell, you always get a room. Or part of one. There aren't any homeless people in hell. Guess it beats certain other places in that regard. Chapter 30. Some very curious things went on after my illegal extradition from Canada, which began in March 1977, was shifted from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where it was to have been held before the same judge who had presided over Butler's and Robideau's acquittal, to an openly hostile court in Fargo, North Dakota. The evidence of government misconduct and willful illegality that had so swayed the Cedar Rapids jury was not allowed in the North Dakota courtroom, nor was the whole history of government-initiated turmoil at Pine Ridge in recent years. What's more, I was amazingly prohibited by the judge from pleading self-defense, as Butler and Robideau had done on the same charges. My entire conviction was based on circumstantial evidence, most of it entirely fabricated, including the so-called murder weapon that was never mine and had nothing to do with the events at Oglala, as the FBI well knew since they had fabricated the entire thing literally lock, stock, and barrel, as their own records later showed. The farce of unbridled lies and flagrant coercion of witnesses played out there, in that courtroom. Meanwhile, to be certain the jury was thoroughly intimidated, the government concocted a cock-and-bull story, quickly spread as gospel by the press, that AIM was going to assault the courtroom at any instant. Officials went so far as to cover the courtroom windows. Federal marshals lurked everywhere, armed to the teeth, eyeing every shadow for non-existent AIM guerrillas. The jury was moved around under heavy guard by SWAT teams. The windows of their bus were taped or painted over. The whole trial was utterly absurd, a travesty, a patent fabrication like so much else. Meanwhile, the prosecution, without a qualm, tossed in endless lies and fabricated evidence with phony witnesses, and the judge allowed all of it. This was the American judicial system at its very worst, scoffing at, even spitting on, the very principles of truth, fairness, and justice on which it is supposedly founded. The understandably terrified all-white jury, eager to get out of there as quickly as possible, took barely 6 hours to come to a guilty verdict on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Even though they were manipulated and intimidated, they might have seen through what was happening and opposed it, as the jurors in Cedar Rapids had done. They, after all, were the ones appointed by society to prevent precisely these kinds of abuses. These jurors, so often laughed at and abused, are the very safeguards of the whole American legal system, and hence, of American democracy itself. They had it in their power, indeed it was their duty, not only to free an innocent man, but to set all this government illegality on its ear. At the end of the Fargo trial, the prosecutor pointed at me and told the trembling jury in a thundering voice that this man seated right before you, had cold-bloodedly killed those already injured agents at point-blank range with a high-powered rifle. And yet, years later, at one of my appeal hearings, this very same prosecutor admitted in court that the government had no idea who it was who killed the agents. He stated, for the record, "We did not have any direct evidence that one individual as opposed to another pulled the trigger." The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, at my 1986 hearing for a new trial, acknowledged that there had been fabrication of evidence, withholding of exculpatory evidence, coercion of witnesses, as well as improper conduct by the FBI. Why then wasn't I instantly released from prison as an innocent man, which I was and had been proven to be even by their own numerous admissions? Simply because, as I've always stated, any Indian would do to pay for the deaths of their agents. Preferably an aimster from outside who could be accused of stirring up trouble on the res. That, apparently, was why outsiders, Butler, Robideau, and myself, had been targeted out of a potential group of 30 or more people at the Jumping Bulls that day. And it also probably explains why charges against Jimmy Eagle, a local man, were dropped. As it turned out, I was to be their boy. Yes, I, Leonard Peltier, was the one. They were taking no chances this time. I was the last Indian left to railroad for the deaths of their two agents. If the feds couldn't get the real killer, they were damn sure going to get me. And they did. The appeals judge who heard that prosecutor's admission still denied my appeal. Later, in 1992, it was ruled that even though not one shred of credible evidence remained to prove my guilt, I was still guilty of aiding and abetting in the deaths of the agents simply by being at the Jumping Bulls that day, and that I would therefore continue to serve 2 consecutive lifetime terms. This, even though the Fargo jury had given me those maximum sentences specifically for supposedly going up and personally murdering those two at close range with a high-powered weapon, not for the vague crime of aiding and abetting. Then that very same judge who denied my appeal bravely came forward years later and declared that the government had been at least equally responsible for the deaths of their own agents. And he actually wrote a letter to President Reagan urging him to commute my sentence. I wish that that judge and that prosecutor, and so many others who might have done so and might still do so, had come forward to declare the truth as they knew it a few years earlier, before my life was stolen from me. Even so, I'm grateful for their belated admissions. The fact that I was convicted without any credible evidence of guilt, and that no amount of genuine evidence to the contrary, however overwhelming, seems to be enough to win my release or even a retrial, much less parole, after nearly a quarter century, is precisely why I am often called, no doubt to the great embarrassment of the United States government, a political prisoner. I'm told that, at last count, more than 25 million people around this Mother Earth have taken time out of their own busy lives to sign a petition pleading for my freedom. I'm grateful to every one of those people. I thank each of you personally. I also value the warm support over the years of the late Mother Teresa, as well as of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, and the other champions of the oppressed and the dispossessed around this planet. Itakoye Oyasin. Yes, it's true. We are all related. Chapter 31. Another very curious thing happened to me a couple years after my Fargo conviction. In fact, right after the Supreme Court's first refusal to review my case in 1979. One day I was unaccountably and without prior notice transferred from the maximum security prison at Marion, Illinois, one of the real hellholes of this earth, the new Alcatraz for incorrigible prisoners, where I'd spent most of my time in isolation, to the comparative low-security prison facility at Lompoc on the balmy California Central Coast, near Santa Barbara. Odd. What was going on? Had they suddenly gone soft-hearted or soft-headed? Not likely. I'd been alerted to the assassination plot by the very man who was originally supposed to do the assassinating, a fellow Native American prisoner at Marion and a tremendously brave human being named Robert Standing Deer Wilson. Under extreme pressure, he had reluctantly agreed to do their dirty work for them and get Peltier. In exchange, they'd promised him that they'd have outstanding murder charges against him dropped, and also that they'd see he got desperately needed medical treatment for an extremely painful spinal contusion he had that they'd refused to treat for years. But after agreeing to their scheme, Standing Deer couldn't bring himself to do it. He came to me and told me the whole scheme. Looking back, I think that's exactly what they wanted him to do. Put me in imminent fear of my life so that I would try to escape. Then I could conveniently be killed while escaping. Standing Deer told me that both of us were to be transferred from Marion after brief stays in Leavenworth to the Lompoc facility. He said that prison officials told him that he wasn't the only assassin they were sending to get me. They said another Indian, unknown to him but also assigned to Lompoc, would have a parallel assignment to his own. Then Standing Deer, having unwittingly played the role they wanted, was kept at Leavenworth while I was sent alone to Lompoc, already knowing, or thinking I knew, that my assassin was in place there, waiting for me. This is precisely what they wanted me to think. Soon after arriving at Lompoc, I was even approached by an overly friendly and suspect native inmate who, I figured, must be the planned assassin. My days at Lompoc were definitely numbered. Unless I wanted to wake up dead one morning soon, I had no choice but to make a break for it. Of course, they really wanted me to try to escape. That would make killing me both convenient and totally justifiable. Still, in retrospect, I deeply regret trying. It was a setup, and I fell for it. I'm forever stricken that both my fellow escapees, who only joined the escape in 1978 in order to help me, have now paid the price. Dallas Thundershield, shot dead from behind as soon as we cut our way out, and Bobby Garcia, found dead 2 years later in the medical unit of the federal prison at Terre Haute, Indiana. They said he hanged himself. Strange. I'm told he also had an overdose of barbiturates in his blood. As for Standing Deer, after playing his unwitting role, his reward was to be dumped back into an iron hole. The last I heard, back in a Texas prison. They don't kill you just once in here. They kill you every day. And every day we're each reborn, like it or not, to live and die again. Why didn't the prison guards kill me during the escape too? No doubt they meant to. After we cut ourselves out, I ran and crawled and burrowed my way through the night over the rough unknown terrain, heading anywhere and nowhere. I could hear their shouts and wailing sirens. Somehow I got away. Maybe I had temporary loan of another ghost shirt. I hid for 5 days in gullies and underbrush. It seemed I had become the eternal fugitive. I was finally discovered by chance in a field by a farmer who alerted the authorities. I guess I could have killed him when he stumbled on me, but I wasn't about to justify all the charges against me. I had an old rifle a friendly skin had slipped me after my escape, but I've never killed anyone, and I never will. I made a brief run for it, but soon saw that further flight was pointless, since they now knew where to look. When they spotted me a few miles away, I made no attempt to resist, but gave up peacefully. After all, with all the publicity about my escape, it would have been awkward to shoot me there in cold blood. I counted on that. I was handcuffed and returned for 1 day to the prison at Lompoc, and then, since I'd only been sent there to fabricate my escape and assassination, I was flown by private charter back to that maximum security hellhole where the whole assassination plot had started, the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. They had a trial and tacked 7 more years onto my 2 consecutive life sentences. Really, by that time, killing me was no longer necessary, unless it could be done quietly, without publicity or public outcry. They certainly wouldn't want to prompt a real investigation by openly murdering me. I was already one of the living dead anyway. I credit the concern of my supporters with keeping me alive from that time to this. Their selfless efforts on my behalf gave me strength, yes, even inspiration, to continue the struggle. So long as they're watching, keeping a sharp eye out, further plots against me are less likely to be hatched. Though I'm sure the feds regret their failure at Lompoc, killing me would serve no great purpose at this point, so long after the fact. Let's face it, those who put me here think they've won. Killing me now would only force a congressional investigation that could unravel that whole twisted skein of government misdeeds from that day on June 26, 1975 to this day.